They chained her in front of the whole town, but one cowboy defied them all with just 3 words: "She's mine." What happened next changed everything. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Let's get started. The frontier town was alive with noise, boots striking the dusty ground, children weaving through the crowd, and rough men calling for whiskey. But at the center of it all stood the sheriff, dragging forward a chained figure. The Apache woman stumbled under the weight of her irons, yet even in weakness, her posture carried a dignity that silenced those who dared look too long. The townsfolk jeered and pointed, taking cruel pleasure in her humiliation. Above them the sun burned without mercy, turning the air heavy and unforgiving. Among the onlookers, Daniel stood, torn between outrage and disbelief. He had ridden into town that morning with no thought beyond restocking supplies for the long trail ahead. His horse was tethered outside the general store, bags half full with coffee, salt, and rope. Daniel never sought trouble, yet trouble had a way of finding him. He leaned against a wooden post, hat pulled low, trying to stay unnoticed. But when the woman's chains clanged against the wooden platform, his eyes lifted. He didn't mean to stare, but something in the set of her jaw, something in her defiant gaze, caught him and refused to let go. The sheriff's voice cut through the square, loud and theatrical. "Here she is, folks. An Apache caught stealing from our wagons. We'll show what becomes of those who think they can take from decent people." The crowd laughed, though many faces carried unease beneath their mirth. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, scanning the woman's face. She looked young, yet hardened by struggle. Sweat traced lines down her cheek, but her eyes stayed fierce. She did not lower her gaze, even as children mocked her and men spat at the ground in her direction. She was fire, bound but unbroken. Daniel's fists clenched as he watched. He had seen injustice before, railroad barons taking land, corrupt sheriffs bending the law, but something about this moment clawed deeper at him. He remembered the stories, whispered across campfires, of entire villages burned under excuses of protection, of treaties broken like twigs under boots. Perhaps she had stolen, perhaps she hadn't. But did it matter? The cruelty here wasn't justice, it was theater. As the sheriff raised his hand, preparing to declare her punishment, Daniel's heartbeat quickened. The world around him dimmed, leaving only the woman's trembling lips, shaping words the crowd could not hear. She looked at him. Not the sheriff, not the jeering men, not the children climbing barrels to get a better view. She looked at Daniel. Her lips parted, dry and cracked, and he caught the whisper carried by desert wind. "Please, claim me." The words struck him harder than any bullet. For a moment he thought he had misheard, that the heat was playing tricks on his mind. But her gaze did not waver. It held him still, binding him as surely as the irons bound her. Daniel's chest tightened, breath catching, as though fate itself had placed him there. The sheriff barked orders, lifting the woman roughly to her feet. She staggered, iron dragging, but her eyes never left Daniel's. He swallowed hard, his hand twitching near the brim of his hat. All around him, townsfolk remained blind, lost in their cruel amusement. They didn't see her silent plea, didn't feel the urgency in her whisper. But Daniel did. He felt the weight of it pressing on him like the desert sun. This was no accident. Destiny had reached into his quiet life and given him a choice: turn away like the rest, or step into her storm. Memories of his past came unbidden, of the brother he had lost in a senseless skirmish, of the guilt he carried for not protecting him. Daniel had sworn never to take sides again, never to fight battles that weren't his. But here, now, the fire in the Apache woman's eyes tore through those walls he had built. He recognized the same defiance his brother once carried, the same desperate courage. Her words echoed inside him, louder than the sheriff's booming speech. "Please, claim me." It wasn't just a request. It was a call to stand for something when everyone else turned away. The sheriff slammed the butt of his rifle against the platform, demanding silence. "This woman will serve as a warning to all who cross our town," he growled. The crowd hushed, anticipation thick in the air. Daniel's heart hammered, his throat dry. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, but he could feel the decision forming inside him like storm clouds gathering. His gaze flicked to the woman again, and in her eyes he saw neither fear nor surrender. She was ready to face whatever awaited her. But she had given him a key. Her whispered words had chained him to her fate. The crowd's noise blurred into a dull roar, and Daniel could hear only his own breath. His boots shifted against the wood, the leather creaking in the heavy silence of his hesitation. He wondered what it meant to claim her. Would it save her life, or would it bind them both in ways he could not yet imagine? He thought of his lonely nights under desert skies, of the weight of a life without purpose. Perhaps this was what he had been waiting for, not peace, but meaning. His hand pressed against the wood post, steadying himself as the sheriff turned. The sheriff's voice boomed again. "Now then, any man here brave enough to say she belongs to him, speak now. Otherwise, her punishment stands." Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and mocking. They expected silence, expected the woman to remain nothing more than a spectacle. But Daniel's pulse roared in his ears, drowning out their voices. He looked at her once more. Chains dug into her wrists, but her gaze was free, fierce, unwavering. And though she had whispered softly, he could almost hear her again, as though her spirit carried the words directly to his heart. "Please, claim me." He thought of walking away. He thought of letting her fate unfold, convincing himself it wasn't his fight, but the weight of his silence would crush him far worse than any enemy's bullet. Daniel shifted his stance, boots scraping against the wood. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened, his shadow cutting long across the sunlit
Square.
The murmurs of the crowd barely registered. All he saw was her chains, her eyes, her plea. Something deep inside told him this was no accident. This was the crossroads of his life, and whichever path he chose, nothing would ever be the same again. The woman's breath trembled, but she held his gaze with unwavering strength. Daniel had seen soldiers flinch in the face of death, seen outlaws beg for mercy, but she stood bound in iron with more dignity than any man in that crowd. It moved something within him, a part of his soul he had thought long buried. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was demanding to be seen, to be claimed as more than a prisoner, more than a symbol. And Daniel realized in that moment that his silence would be the true betrayal of everything he believed. As the sheriff scanned the crowd, his smug smile growing, Daniel felt his body move before his mind could protest. His boots thudded against the wooden planks as he stepped forward. The townsfolk turned muttering, surprised at the cowboy who had been nothing more than a quiet stranger moments ago. Daniel's heart raced, but his voice, when it came, was steady, calm, and unyielding. "She's not your prisoner," he said, locking eyes with the sheriff. "She's mine." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Daniel's gaze never faltered. The woman's lips parted, her whisper finally answered, her destiny no longer her own. The sheriff's jaw tightened as the words hung in the air. "She's mine," Daniel had said, defying the law, the town, and the unspoken rules of the land. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, faces twisting between disbelief and outrage. A cowboy, a stranger, had dared to claim what they thought was property, a spectacle meant to entertain. The chains rattled as the young Apache woman turned toward him, her breath catching. For the first time in days, hope flickered in her eyes. Daniel knew then he couldn't back down, not now, not ever. His heart was already bound to hers. The sheriff spat on the ground, stepping closer, his boots grinding against the dusty earth. "You can't just say it, boy," he growled, voice hard as stone. "This isn't the way things are done here." The crowd leaned forward, tension mounting like a storm on the horizon. But Daniel didn't flinch. He squared his shoulders, his eyes locked on the woman beside him, her wrists raw from the shackles. "Then I'll make it the way things are done," Daniel shot back. His voice carried steady, slicing through the heavy air like a blade. Gasps and whispers spread. The Apache woman, her chest rising and falling quickly, touched the iron that bound her, testing the strength of chains. The sheriff sneered, signaling to the blacksmith to keep hold of the keys. Daniel's hand twitched near his holster, but he kept still, for now. This wasn't about rage or impulse. This was about her, about the silent plea in her voice when she said, "Please claim me." The words echoed inside him like a vow. He would not fail her. The townsfolk were caught in a strange silence, torn between fear of defiance and fascination. With courage, women in bonnets clutched children closer, while men whispered about blood that would surely spill. Daniel finally stepped closer, his boots steady against the cracked earth. "You've made a show of her suffering," he said, his voice loud enough to reach the edge of the crowd. "But she's not yours. She's a woman with dignity, and today she walks free." His words stirred something restless in the air. The sheriff's hand hovered near his revolver, but Daniel was quicker. With a sudden, practiced motion, he drew his Colt and pointed it straight, not at the sheriff, but at the chains. One sharp shot rang out, startling horses tied along the post. The crowd screamed, ducking from the gunfire, but when the dust settled, the links around her wrist had snapped loose. Silence followed. The young Apache woman gasped, clutching her free hand to her chest as the chain clattered to the ground. She turned to him, eyes wide, not with fear but awe. A single tear slipped down her cheek, carrying with it days of torment and despair. Daniel's breath hitched as she whispered, trembling, "You claimed me." For her, those words were not just gratitude. They were a bond, unbreakable and sacred. Behind them, the sheriff's men began to advance, hands on their weapons. Daniel knew the fight wasn't finished, but he also knew he wouldn't walk away without her. She was his purpose now, his promise. The crowd parted slightly as the sheriff raised his hand. "This isn't over, Cowboy," he said coldly. "You've made yourself an enemy of this town." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. He holstered his weapon, then reached for the Apache woman's hand, still bound by a chain on the other wrist. His fingers wrapped around hers gently, offering strength. "Then let the whole town know," Daniel answered, his voice even. "I'll take on every enemy if it means she's free." The woman's eyes shone, not with tears now, but with pride. Together they walked, step by step, through the hush of stunned townsfolk. No one dared block their path, not with Daniel's resolve burning like wildfire. Some looked away, ashamed, at their silence. Others watched with curiosity, as though sensing history in the making. The sun burned high above, casting long shadows across the square. The sheriff didn't move to stop them, though his glare promised vengeance. Still, Daniel pressed forward, the woman by his side. Her chains rattled with each step, but to Daniel they sounded more like bells of freedom. When they reached the edge of town, the Apache woman stopped, her breathing heavy. She looked at him, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Why risk your life for me?" Daniel's chest rose and fell as he met her gaze. "Because when you asked me to claim you, you gave me a reason to fight. A man without a reason is nothing." Her face softened, her hand clutching his tighter. For the first time she smiled faintly, though exhaustion tugged at her. She knew his words were true. He hadn't just saved her, he had chosen her. Beyond the town stretched the desert, vast and untamed. Daniel helped her onto his horse, the leather saddle creaking beneath their weight. As the animal began to move, he kept one arm around her, steadying her fragile body. Behind them, voices rose again in the square, arguments about law and rebellion, echoing, but the desert wind carried them away, erasing the noise until there was only silence and the steady rhythm of hooves. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder, whispering softly, "Now I'm yours forever." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, the promise burning deep within him. The desert stretched endlessly, yet Daniel no longer saw it as barren. With her by his side, every mile was alive with purpose. She was more than a woman he had freed. She was the soul he had been searching for in his wandering. In her eyes, he saw strength forged by suffering, and in her voice he heard the beginnings of love. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky crimson and gold, Daniel understood the truth. He hadn't just claimed her. Together, they had claimed her destiny beyond chains, beyond cruelty, beyond fear, and nothing could break it.